The Beaumont estate sat miles away from the nearest paved road, swallowed by the slow, humid breath of southern Louisiana. Spanish moss dangled from ancient cypress trees like worn funeral veils, and the air carried a permanent scent of swamp water and tobacco leaves. To outsiders, the mansion looked like a monument to old money and generational power. To the people who worked inside its walls, it felt more like a place where memories were buried alongside bones. Richard Beaumont believed himself untouchable. At 50 years old, he still walked through the estate with the confidence of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. He kept his suits pressed, his shoes polished, and his daily meals measured to the gram by a personal nutritionist he paid to live on the property. Richard is obsessed over longevity. He drank imported mineral water, avoided alcohol, and scheduled monthly health screenings. He often joked that he planned to outlive every man who ever doubted him. Then, the coughing started. It began as something small, a dry irritation scratching the back of his throat during late evenings when he reviewed business accounts in his study. He blamed the dusty warehouse buildings where his tobacco shipments were processed. The estate manager blamed the seasonal pollen. The house doctor blamed stress. Richard accepted each explanation without much concern, because men like him never believed their bodies could betray them. But within weeks, the irritation deepened into something heavier. His breathing became uneven at night, forcing him to wake up gasping as if someone had pressed a weight onto his chest. Soon, faint streaks of red began appearing on the crisp white handkerchiefs he carried in his breast pocket. He told no one. Instead, he doubled his vitamins and demanded stronger air purifiers be installed throughout the house. What Richard didn't know was that his illness had not begun weeks earlier. It started 10 years ago. On the opposite side of the mansion's second floor, a woman named Eliza Carter carefully folded freshly pressed bedding inside the estate's laundry room. She had worked her way into becoming the head house attendant, trusted with handling every piece of fabric that touched Richard's private quarters. At 27, she had earned a reputation for flawless precision. Every seam she repaired looked invisible. Every sheet she delivered felt softer than the last. To Richard, she was just another employee who never spoke unless spoken to. To Eliza, every thread she stitched carried a memory she refused to forget. 10 years earlier, she had stood behind an abandoned tobacco barn and watched her younger sister vanish into a night filled with screaming crickets and shattered glass. She remembered the silver sewing thimble her sister always carried for luck. She remembered finding it in the mud the next morning. Most of all, she remembered seeing Richard Beaumont walk away from that barn without looking back once. Since returning to the estate months ago under a new management contract, Eliza had waited patiently. She never rushed. She never showed anger. She only worked and prepared. Each Monday, she removed the bedding from Richard's master suite. Each Tuesday, she returned it freshly restored. And hidden deep within the delicate stitching of his luxury pillow lining was something no doctor, inspector, or security guard had ever thought to search for. Night after night, Richard rested his head exactly where she needed him to. And night after night, his breathing grew worse. Because sometimes revenge doesn't arrive with noise or violence. Sometimes it waits quietly in the place a man feels safest, until every breath he takes begins turning against him. If you enjoyed dark storytelling that uncovers secrets Richard Beaumont had built his reputation on control, precision, and an almost obsessive belief that preparation could outsmart fate. That belief started crumbling the moment his private physician arrived from Baton Rouge for what was supposed to be a routine wellness evaluation. Richard expected reassurance. Instead, he received confusion disguised as professionalism. The physician conducted extensive lung scans, blood tests, and respiratory examinations that stretched across an entire afternoon. Each result returned strangely inconclusive. The inflammation inside Richard's lungs resembled exposure to a severe industrial contaminant, yet no trace of chemicals appeared in his bloodstream. The doctor recommended specialized testing in New Orleans, but Richard dismissed the suggestion, refusing to leave his estate while major financial negotiations were underway. His refusal was rooted in pride, but also in fear he would never admit aloud. The Beaumont estate was more than a residence. It represented authority, wealth, and legacy. Leaving it felt like surrender, and surrender had never been a language Richard understood. Instead, he ordered an internal investigation. Every cook, groundskeeper, and household employee was questioned about potential toxins, contaminated food, or tampered water supplies. Security staff replaced kitchen ingredients, inspected storage facilities, and installed additional filtration systems throughout the mansion. None of it slowed his deterioration. While Richard spiraled into paranoia, Eliza Carter continued her routine with unsettling calm. She moved through the mansion with the grace of someone who had memorized every hallway and shadow. She polished silverware in the dining room while listening to servants whisper about Richard's worsening condition. She repaired curtains in the guest wing while overhearing supervisors debate whether the estate might soon change ownership. She absorbed every conversation, storing information the same way she stored her tools, with meticulous organization and purpose. Late one evening, she returned to the laundry chamber carrying a sealed wooden container hidden beneath folded linens. The room glowed under dim overhead lighting, casting elongated shadows across the industrial washing basins. She carefully opened the container and revealed a finely crushed powder that shimmered faintly under the light. She handled it with surgical patience, measuring precise amounts before weaving it into the interior stitching of a new silk pillow lining. Her fingers moved with extraordinary control, reflecting years of mastering textile repair techniques. Each stitch looked flawless from the outside, while concealing the deadly secret within the fabric's inner layer. Downstairs, Richard sat in his study reviewing financial ledgers while struggling to inhale without sharp bursts of pain slicing through his chest. His once steady hands trembled as he turned pages filled with profit margins and investment expansions. He blamed corporate rivals, former partners, and even distant relatives who might benefit from his collapse. The idea that his danger lived inside his own bedroom never crossed his mind. His security staff guarded gates, monitored deliveries, and screened visitors, yet they overlooked the one person who had unrestricted access to his most private sanctuary. That night, as heavy rain hammered against the mansion's towering windows, Eliza personally delivered the freshly replaced pillowcase to Richard's bedroom. She smoothed the bedding with professional care, while he remained downstairs arguing with his estate lawyer about potential insurance fraud. She finished her task, stepped into the hallway, and paused for a brief moment while gripping the silver thimble resting in her pocket. The storm outside intensified, echoing through the corridors like distant applause for something inevitable. Moments later, Richard climbed into bed, unaware that the storm battering the estate was nothing compared to the silent storm waiting inches beneath his cheek. Because by morning, his coughing would grow violent enough to force him into decisions that would place every servant inside the mansion under terrifying suspicion, and Eliza's carefully hidden weapon would face its first real risk of discovery. By sunrise, the Beaumont estate no longer resembled the polished symbol of power it had been for decades. It felt unstable, tense, and filled with the quiet panic that spreads when authority begins to crack. Richard Beaumont had barely slept through the night. Each attempt at rest had collapsed into violent coughing that left his throat raw and his silk sheets stained with thin streaks of blood. The mansion doctor arrived before breakfast, summoned urgently after a servant reported hearing Richard collapse beside his bed during the early morning hours. The doctor examined him again with growing unease, listening to his lungs with a stethoscope while Richard struggled to breathe through shallow, uneven gasps. The sound reminded the physician of severe lung trauma, usually seen in industrial accident victims, yet Richard had never stepped foot near dangerous manufacturing environments. The contradiction unsettled him, but Richard's patience dissolved before any deeper explanation could form. Instead of accepting medical concern, Richard exploded into suspicion. He accused the kitchen staff of poisoning his meals. He accused the maintenance crew of contaminating ventilation systems. He accused the estate manager of plotting a hostile takeover through slow biological sabotage. His rage carried through the mansion halls, forcing employees to gather in the grand dining room for an emergency interrogation. Servants stood in rigid silence while security officers inspected personal belongings, storage lockers, and living quarters. Every drawer, suitcase, and cabinet was emptied onto marble floors as Richard demanded proof that someone was attempting to assassinate him through undetectable means. Eliza Carter stood among them with perfect composure, her posture relaxed and her expression carefully neutral. She allowed guards to search her uniform pockets, her sewing kit, and even the small storage locker assigned to her inside the laundry wing. They found needles, thread spools, fabric patches, and standard repair tools that confirmed her role as the estate's most trusted textile specialist. When security officers moved on, she quietly resumed folding linens alongside the other attendants, listening to whispered fears spreading through the staff. Some worried they would be dismissed without pay if Richard's paranoia intensified. Others feared physical punishment, remembering how violently he had reacted to minor mistakes in the past. Meanwhile, Richard escalated his investigation beyond the servants. He ordered laboratory testing of every water source feeding the estate and demanded forensic screening of imported food shipments. He even instructed his legal team to contact private investigators specializing in corporate espionage. Each test returned clean results, deepening his terror because it eliminated enemies he could confront directly. The more answers he failed to receive, the more violently his illness worsened, creating a vicious cycle of fear feeding physical decline. That afternoon, while storm clouds gathered again over the Louisiana marshland, Eliza returned to the master bedroom carrying freshly pressed sheets. She replaced the bedding with deliberate precision, adjusting the pillows exactly the way Richard preferred. Her hands never trembled, yet her mind replayed memories she had buried for 10 years. She remembered her sister's final screams echoing through a collapsing tobacco barn. She remembered standing helplessly in darkness while power and wealth erased accountability. The mansion around her now stood as both crime scene and execution chamber, and she intended to finish what time had started. Downstairs, Richard reviewed surveillance footage from estate cameras, searching desperately for unusual movements or suspicious behavior. His breathing grew heavier as panic clouded his judgment, causing him to overlook the simplest truth. The danger he feared was not entering the mansion from outside walls. It had already been stitched into the most personal space he possessed. Because that night, his investigation would take a terrifying turn when he decided to isolate every servant inside the estate until he uncovered the traitor among them. And that lockdown would trap Eliza inside the mansion with him, bringing her closer to exposure than she had ever been before. Richard Beaumont announced the lockdown just before sunset, gathering every employee inside the grand ballroom beneath the estate's massive crystal chandelier. His voice carried a strained authority, weakened by his worsening breathing, yet sharpened by desperation. He declared that no servant, contractor, or staff member would leave the property until his mysterious illness was explained. Armed security guards sealed the front gates, disabled vehicle access, and established surveillance checkpoints throughout the mansion grounds. Richard justified the extreme measure as protection against an internal assassin, but the fear spreading across the servants' faces revealed how quickly protection could feel like imprisonment. The ballroom remained suffocatingly silent as employees exchanged anxious glances. Many relied entirely on their estate wages to support families living miles away, and the thought of being trapped under Richard's growing paranoia terrified them. Several attendants attempted to protest respectfully, suggesting medical specialists or law enforcement involvement, but Richard dismissed every recommendation with bitter hostility. He insisted that outside authorities could not be trusted, convinced his enemies were wealthy enough to manipulate investigators. His isolationist thinking transformed the mansion into a pressure chamber filled with suspicion and dread. Eliza Carter stood near the back of the ballroom, blending seamlessly into the crowd of uniformed staff members. Her expression remained composed, though her mind calculated every risk created by the sudden confinement. She had anticipated Richard's paranoia, yet she had not expected him to restrict movement across the entire property. Her remaining supply of crushed glass powder was hidden within the laundry wing, carefully sealed inside a reinforced container disguised as fabric treatment material. If security teams expanded their search toward maintenance storage rooms, her operation could unravel instantly. She needed to adapt quickly, but she could not show urgency or unusual behavior without drawing attention. As the gathering ended, security officers assigned specific sleeping quarters to every employee, forbidding them from accessing unauthorized areas after midnight. The restriction forced Eliza to remain inside the main mansion rather than retreating to the detached staff housing where she normally stayed. Ironically, the lockdown placed her closer to Richard's private chambers, offering easier access to maintain her sabotage while simultaneously increasing surveillance risk. The duality of opportunity and danger tightened around her like invisible chains. Later that evening, Richard retreated to his private office accompanied by his personal attorney and a state security chief. He demanded continuous monitoring of all staff communications, including phone calls and internet activity. His paranoia expanded beyond poisoning theories, convincing him that psychological warfare might be targeting him through environmental manipulation. He ordered air quality testing in every bedroom, unaware that microscopic glass fragments already floated invisibly within his personal bedding. Each breath he took while issuing commands carried another wave of silent damage through his lungs. Near midnight, Eliza moved through the darkened laundry corridor under the pretense of completing emergency fabric repairs requested by management. Surveillance cameras tracked her movement, but her tasks aligned perfectly with her documented responsibilities. Inside the laundry chamber, she retrieved her concealed container and prepared another pillow lining, weaving the shimmering powder deeper into the silk structure. Her precision reflected years of practice, yet tonight carried heavier emotional weight because she understood the lockdown eliminated her escape options if discovery occurred. Upstairs, Richard attempted to sleep while security guards patrolled hallways outside his bedroom door. Thunder rolled across the marshland as humid air pressed against the mansion windows. He coughed violently, clutching his chest while struggling to inhale. The pain intensified with terrifying speed, convincing him that his unseen enemy had accelerated their attack. He reached for his emergency oxygen inhaler, unaware that the greatest threat still rested inches beneath his head. Because by morning, Richard would become convinced that one specific servant was responsible for his suffering, and his investigation would focus dangerously close to Eliza, forcing her to make a decision that could either complete her revenge or destroy everything she had spent 10 years preparing. The following morning arrived under a suffocating blanket of gray clouds that pressed low over the Beaumont estate, mirroring the tension coiling through its corridors. Richard Beaumont had not slept longer than 20 consecutive minutes, and exhaustion sharpened his paranoia into something far more dangerous than simple suspicion. His coughing had escalated into violent spasms that left him doubled over, gripping furniture for support, while thin sprays of blood stained the expensive rugs imported from Europe.
The mansion doctor pleaded with him to seek emergency hospitalization, warning that his lung damage was progressing at an alarming rate. Richard rejected the suggestion with cold fury, convinced that leaving the estate would allow his invisible enemy to escape punishment. Instead, he announced that he had identified the traitor responsible for his illness. Security guards dragged the estate's head cook, Margaret Lawson, into the main dining hall, while dozens of servants were forced to witness the confrontation. Margaret had worked on the property for nearly 2 decades, preparing meals for Richard's family long before he inherited control of the estate. Her loyalty had never been questioned until Richard became convinced that her access to his food and beverages provided the perfect opportunity to poison him slowly. He accused her of contaminating his coffee with metallic toxins and tainting his meals with corrosive compounds designed to destroy his respiratory system from within. Margaret denied every accusation through trembling tears, insisting she had followed his strict dietary instructions without deviation. The scene unfolded with suffocating intensity as Richard demanded a full inspection of the kitchen facility. Storage freezers were emptied, spice containers were tested, and every cooking utensil was subjected to chemical analysis using portable forensic equipment. The results, again, revealed nothing unusual. Despite the lack of evidence, Richard's anger continued escalating, fueled by physical pain and deteriorating judgment. He ordered Margaret confined to a secured guest room while further investigations continued, effectively imprisoning her based on fear alone. Eliza Carter observed the entire confrontation while standing beside a row of silent attendants. She felt a complicated surge of emotion watching an innocent woman suffer under Richard's unraveling authority. Margaret had occasionally offered Eliza quiet kindness during long workdays, sharing leftover pastries or defending younger staff from harsh discipline. For a brief moment, Eliza considered whether her revenge had begun harming people she never intended to target.
The thought lingered painfully, yet the memory of her sister's final moments resurfaced with crushing clarity, reminding her why she had endured years of patience to reach this point. Later that afternoon, Eliza returned to the master bedroom to replace Richard's bedding under direct supervision from armed guards assigned to monitor all servant activity. She performed her duties flawlessly while security officers inspected every fabric piece she carried into the room. They examined pillowcases, sheet seams, and decorative stitching without discovering the hidden microscopic shards embedded deep inside the pillow lining. Their inspection remained surface level, missing the precise location where Eliza had engineered her lethal design. Richard watched from a nearby armchair, his breathing uneven and his eyes filled with suspicion as he studied her movements. For several agonizing seconds, their gazes locked. He searched her expression for guilt, hesitation, or fear, yet found only calm professionalism. His attention eventually drifted toward another coughing episode that left him clutching his ribs in agony, allowing Eliza to complete her task without interruption. As she exited the bedroom, thunder echoed across the marshland once again, rattling the mansion windows like distant warning signals. Eliza sensed that Richard's desperation would soon drive him toward more extreme measures, possibly expanding his investigation beyond food and water contamination. Because by nightfall, Richard would summon a private forensic consultant known for exposing hidden sabotage methods, and that specialist would begin examining the one place Eliza believed was completely safe from discovery. The private forensic consultant arrived at the Beaumont estate shortly after sunset, escorted through the locked front gates by Richard's security detail as heavy storm clouds rolled across the Louisiana horizon. His name was Daniel Crow, a specialist known for solving corporate sabotage cases that traditional investigators often overlooked. Daniel carried himself with quiet confidence, the kind earned through years of dismantling elaborate poisoning schemes and environmental contamination plots. Unlike Richard's previous investigators, Daniel relied less on intimidation and more on observation, carefully studying surroundings before forming conclusions. Richard welcomed him inside the mansion with visible relief disguised as authority. His appearance had worsened dramatically within the last 24 hours. Dark circles hollowed his eyes, and his breathing carried a constant rattling undertone that made every sentence sound like a struggle against suffocation. He explained his symptoms, his suspicions, and the extensive internal investigations that had failed to identify a culprit. Daniel listened patiently while taking notes, occasionally asking pointed questions about Richard's daily routine, sleeping environment, and exposure to industrial materials. The focus on bedroom conditions seemed routine to Richard, but it sent a silent alarm through Eliza Carter when she overheard fragments of the conversation while arranging linens in the hallway. Daniel began his inspection by analyzing ventilation systems, water filtration units, and kitchen storage facilities. He collected air samples, swabbed surfaces, and tested cleaning chemicals used throughout the mansion. His methodology impressed the estate staff, who watched nervously as he worked with methodical precision. Unlike Richard's previous investigators, Daniel treated every location as equally suspicious, refusing to prioritize obvious contamination sources. His calm demeanor created an unsettling contrast against Richard's escalating panic, which grew worse each time Daniel eliminated another potential cause. Late that evening, Daniel requested access to Richard's private bedroom, explaining that many undetected respiratory hazards originated within personal sleeping environments, where individuals remained exposed for extended hours. Richard agreed immediately, desperate for answers, while Eliza stood frozen beside a laundry cart positioned just outside the hallway. She maintained her professional composure as Daniel entered the bedroom accompanied by security guards and portable forensic equipment. She could hear drawers opening, mattress seams being examined, and air samples being collected from various corners of the room. Every sound echoed through her chest like distant thunder, signaling approaching disaster. Inside the bedroom, Daniel conducted a meticulous inspection of curtains, upholstery, and decorative fabrics. He carefully analyzed dust particles collected from window frames and nightstand surfaces, searching for microscopic irritants that could explain Richard's lung deterioration. His attention eventually shifted toward the bed itself, where he began examining mattress layers and pillow structures with clinical focus. He removed outer pillowcases and studied the silk fabric under specialized lighting designed to reveal hidden contaminants. The guards observed silently, while Richard sat in a nearby chair, watching with desperate anticipation. Eliza's pulse accelerated as minutes stretched into unbearable tension. She had engineered her sabotage with extreme care, embedding the crushed glass powder inside interior stitching layers invisible under casual inspection. However, Daniel's equipment allowed him to detect irregular particle patterns within textile fibers. After several long moments, he paused while adjusting his magnifying lens closer to the pillow lining. His expression shifted slightly, revealing the first hint that he might be noticing something unusual buried beneath the silk's flawless exterior. Richard leaned forward, sensing potential discovery, while Eliza forced herself to continue organizing folded linens without betraying her rising dread. She understood that Daniel's curiosity could unravel 10 years of patience within seconds if he chose to dismantle the pillow structure entirely. Because as Daniel reached for a precision seam cutter to open the pillow lining for deeper examination, Eliza realized that her entire plan balanced on the edge of exposure, and she would soon face a decision that could determine whether Richard died believing his illness was natural or lived long enough to uncover the truth behind his slow, suffocating. Daniel Crowe positioned the precision seam cutter against the silk pillow lining with careful deliberation, preparing to expose the hidden interior layers that had drawn his professional suspicion. The bedroom had fallen into suffocating silence as Richard Beaumont watched from his chair, gripping the armrest with trembling fingers while struggling to steady his breathing. Security guards stood motionless beside the doorway, their presence creating an atmosphere heavy with anticipation. Daniel's trained instincts warned him that he was approaching something significant, something subtle enough to escape routine inspections, yet dangerous enough to destroy human tissue over prolonged exposure. Just as the blade began sliding toward the delicate stitching, a sudden crash erupted from downstairs, echoing violently through the mansion halls. The sound of shattering glass, followed by frantic shouting, shattered the fragile calm inside the bedroom. One of the security guards immediately received a radio alert reporting that a maintenance worker had collapsed near the estate's generator control room after triggering an electrical surge that temporarily disabled portions of the mansion's surveillance system. The unexpected emergency demanded immediate attention, forcing the guards to abandon their positions and rush toward the lower floors. Richard erupted into furious confusion, ordering them to restore power instantly while coughing uncontrollably into a blood-stained handkerchief. Daniel hesitated, glancing between the half-examined pillow and the escalating emergency unfolding beyond the bedroom walls. Professional responsibility forced him to follow the guards downstairs to ensure no hazardous chemical or environmental malfunction had endangered additional staff members. Within seconds, the bedroom emptied, leaving only Richard, Daniel's unopened equipment case, and the bed that quietly continued releasing microscopic destruction into the air. Outside in the hallway, Eliza Carter stood frozen beside her laundry cart, her mind racing through the sudden shift in events. She had not caused the generator accident, yet she recognized the rare opportunity unfolding before her. As security personnel and Daniel disappeared toward the lower levels, she stepped cautiously toward the bedroom doorway, her movements masked by the confusion rippling through the mansion. Richard remained seated with his back partially turned, struggling through another violent coughing episode that forced him to focus entirely on his own pain. Eliza entered silently, approaching the bed with professional urgency disguised as routine housekeeping concern. She noticed Daniel had loosened part of the pillow seam without fully opening it, leaving her hidden work dangerously exposed. With swift but precise movements, she adjusted the fabric alignment and reinforced the stitching using thread concealed inside her uniform sleeve. Her years of textile mastery allowed her to restore the pillow's flawless appearance within moments, eliminating the subtle irregularities that had triggered Daniel's suspicion. Behind her, Richard attempted to stand, his legs shaking under the strain of exhaustion and oxygen deprivation. He glanced toward Eliza, his expression distorted by pain and paranoia, yet he lacked the strength to question her presence. She finished smoothing the bedding and stepped back, maintaining the calm professionalism that had shielded her from scrutiny for months. Every movement felt heavier, knowing she had just prevented the one discovery that could have ended her revenge instantly. Minutes later, emergency lights flickered back to life as power returned across the estate. Daniel reappeared in the hallway, explaining that the generator malfunction had been caused by faulty wiring rather than sabotage. He returned to the bedroom intending to resume his inspection, yet his attention shifted toward the estate's ventilation shafts, which now required urgent reevaluation after the electrical surge disrupted airflow systems. The pillow examination was postponed, leaving Eliza's secret buried once again beneath layers of silk and feathers. Richard collapsed onto his bed shortly afterward, exhausted beyond resistance, inhaling deeply against his failing lungs while the restored power hummed quietly through the mansion walls. Eliza retreated down the hallway, her heartbeat slowly stabilizing as she realized how narrowly her plan had survived exposure. Because Daniel Crow's curiosity had not faded, and the near discovery would drive him to widen his investigation beyond fabrics and air systems,
leading him toward a hidden memory buried in the estate's past that could expose not only Richard's illness, but the violent secret that started everything 10 years earlier.
Daniel Crowe did not forget the irregularity he had glimpsed inside Richard Beaumont's pillow, and the interruption caused by the generator failure only intensified his determination to search for deeper answers. By early morning, he expanded his investigation beyond environmental hazards and shifted toward historical patterns connected to the estate itself. Daniel understood that slow, untraceable harm often originated from personal vendettas rather than random industrial contamination. His experience taught him that hidden motives frequently buried themselves inside forgotten tragedies, especially within powerful families who controlled their own narratives. While Richard remained confined to his bedroom, recovering from another sleepless night filled with suffocating coughing fits, Daniel requested access to estate records, employee turnover logs, and archived incident reports dating back at least 15 years. The estate manager reluctantly provided the documents, clearly uncomfortable revisiting past controversies that Richard had aggressively suppressed. Daniel reviewed every file with relentless patience, searching for connections between former employees and potential revenge motives. Several reports described workplace injuries and sudden staff disappearances, yet one incident stood out because of its vague documentation and unusually abrupt closure. 10 years earlier, a maintenance accident had reportedly caused the partial collapse of an abandoned tobacco smokehouse located near the swamp's edge. The official report claimed structural decay caused the building to cave in during a storm, resulting in the tragic disappearance of a teenage seasonal worker whose body was never recovered. The case had been ruled an unfortunate accident, signed off by local authorities within days. However, Daniel noticed inconsistencies between witness statements and repair invoices submitted shortly after the collapse. The financial records suggested emergency reconstruction efforts occurred faster than normal safety inspections would allow, hinting that someone had rushed to erase physical evidence before investigators could conduct a thorough examination. Intrigued by the discrepancy, Daniel requested permission to inspect the smokehouse ruins personally. The estate manager hesitated, explaining that Richard rarely allowed visitors near that section of the property because unstable swamp terrain made travel dangerous. Daniel insisted, arguing that environmental contamination could easily originate from deteriorating industrial structures. Eventually, permission was granted under security escort, though the delay gave Eliza Carter time to overhear fragments of the plan while replacing linens inside the guest wing. The moment she heard Daniel mention the smokehouse, her chest tightened with a silent alarm. The building represented the exact location where her sister had vanished, and where Richard's darkest secret remained buried beneath layers of rotting wood and swamp sediment. She maintained her outward composure while folding sheets, but inside she calculated how quickly Daniel might uncover physical evidence linking Richard to that long-forgotten crime. Daniel's investigation threatened to unravel that balance entirely. Later that afternoon, Daniel and 2 security guards traveled across muddy estate trails toward the collapsed smokehouse. Thick humidity clung to the air as insects buzzed through dense marsh vegetation surrounding the decaying structure. The building's skeletal remains leaned dangerously over a section of sunken flooring where swamp water had slowly consumed the foundation. Daniel studied the site carefully, noticing subtle ground disturbances inconsistent with natural collapse patterns. He ordered guards to assist him in clearing debris from the unstable entrance while documenting every observation through photographic evidence. Back at the mansion, Richard struggled through another episode of choking pain, unaware that Daniel's investigation was drifting closer to the truth he had buried a decade earlier. Meanwhile, Eliza stood at an upstairs window watching storm clouds gather once again over the distant swamp, her hand gripping the silver thimble hidden inside her pocket as memories resurfaced with suffocating clarity. Because as Daniel prepared to remove the first layer of collapsed flooring inside the smokehouse, he would soon uncover something preserved beneath the mud that could expose Richard's past crime, and force Eliza to confront whether she truly wanted justice revealed or revenge completed in silence. The collapsed smokehouse stood like a wounded monument at the edge of the Beaumont estate, its broken beams leaning into swamp water that had slowly swallowed the foundation over the last decade. Daniel Crowe approached the structure with methodical caution, stepping across unstable planks while security guards cleared debris from the entrance. The air inside the ruins carried a damp, metallic scent that suggested long-term decay mixed with something far older and more disturbing. Daniel's instincts sharpened as he examined irregular depressions in the mud floor, noticing areas where soil density differed from natural erosion patterns. He directed the guards to remove rotting boards covering the sunken interior, exposing layers of thick marsh sediment hardened by years of flooding and drought cycles. As they worked, Daniel carefully photographed each stage of the excavation, documenting structural inconsistencies that supported his growing suspicion that the collapse had been manipulated rather than accidental. Several inches beneath the surface, one guard's shovel struck something solid that produced a dull, metallic echo. The sound froze the group in tense silence as Daniel knelt to brush away layers of compacted mud using a small forensic brush. Slowly, fragments of corroded metal emerged, revealing what appeared to be a shattered glass decanter handle tangled within rotted fabric remnants. Daniel examined the object with growing unease, recognizing that decorative household glass rarely belonged inside an abandoned smokehouse. He ordered the guards to widen the excavation area, revealing additional evidence buried beneath the mud. Within minutes, they uncovered skeletal remains partially preserved by swamp sediment, positioned in a way that suggested the victim had been placed deliberately, rather than trapped by falling debris. A thin, silver sewing thimble rested beside the remains, dulled by corrosion yet still recognizable as a personal belonging rather than construction equipment. Daniel's pulse accelerated as he documented the discovery, realizing he had uncovered evidence of a concealed homicide rather than a maintenance accident. He immediately instructed security to notify local law enforcement while securing the scene to prevent contamination. His investigation had transformed from environmental sabotage into a criminal case that threatened to dismantle the Beaumont legacy entirely. Back at the mansion, Eliza Carter felt an unexplainable shift in the atmosphere as emergency vehicles began appearing along distant estate roads. She watched from an upper balcony as flashing lights reflected across the marshland horizon, understanding instantly that Daniel had found something buried at the smokehouse. A storm brewed within her emotions, blending relief, fear, and an overwhelming resurgence of grief she had suppressed for 10 years. She had never expected physical proof of her sister's death to surface publicly, and the sudden exposure threatened to steal the private justice she had spent a decade orchestrating. Meanwhile, Richard Beaumont remained confined to his bedroom, too physically weak to investigate the commotion spreading across his property. His breathing had deteriorated into shallow, desperate gasps that forced him to remain propped against stacked pillows, while blood stained the corners of his lips. Security personnel eventually entered his room, explaining that authorities had discovered human remains linked to an unsolved disappearance connected to his estate's history. Richard's expression collapsed under the weight of recognition he tried desperately to suppress. Memories he had buried beneath wealth and power surged back with suffocating clarity, colliding with the invisible punishment already tearing through his lungs. Eliza stood silently outside the bedroom doorway, overhearing fragments of the conversation while gripping the silver thimble hidden in her palm. She realized the past had risen from the swamp exactly as she had feared, forcing her revenge into the public spotlight she never intended. Because investigators prepared to question every employee connected to the estate's history, Richard would soon begin connecting Eliza to the girl whose remains had just been uncovered, and his realization would drive him toward a confrontation that neither of them had prepared to survive. The discovery at the smokehouse shattered the fragile illusion of control Richard Beaumont had maintained for a decade,
and the news spread through the mansion with the unstoppable force of a storm breaking through levees. Law enforcement vehicles lined the estate driveway, while investigators moved through the property, collecting records, interviewing long-term employees, and reconstructing timelines connected to the missing seasonal worker whose remains had finally surfaced from beneath the swamp mud. Richard remained confined to his bedroom, physically incapable of joining the investigation, yet emotionally trapped inside memories he had spent years burying beneath wealth, intimidation, and calculated silence. The moment security officers informed him that investigators had recovered a silver sewing thimble beside the skeletal remains, something inside Richard fractured beyond repair. His mind returned instantly to the night he had convinced himself was erased forever. He remembered the broken decanter, the violent confrontation inside the abandoned tobacco building, and the terrified teenager whose death he had dismissed as an unfortunate inconvenience threatening his reputation. He had buried her body personally, sealing the secret beneath collapsing floorboards while bribing local authorities to label the incident as structural failure. He had believed time and money would silence the truth permanently. Now, time had returned the truth with suffocating precision. While investigators moved throughout the estate, Richard demanded access to employee records spanning the last year, searching obsessively for anyone connected to the victim. His breathing deteriorated further as he flipped through personnel files with shaking hands, scanning photographs and employment histories while coughing violently between each page. When he reached Eliza Carter's file, his vision blurred with a mixture of physical agony and dawning recognition. The photograph displayed a composed woman with steady eyes and flawless professional credentials, yet her facial features triggered a memory he had refused to confront for 10 years. The resemblance between Eliza and the girl buried beneath the smokehouse struck him with horrifying clarity. He ordered security to summon her immediately. Eliza was finishing routine linen inventory inside the laundry chamber when armed guards approached and instructed her to report to Richard's private bedroom. She followed without protest, her heartbeat steady despite understanding that the moment she had carefully delayed for years had finally arrived. As she walked through the mansion corridors, she passed investigators documenting evidence and servants whispering in fearful confusion. Every step carried the weight of past and present colliding inside the same suffocating walls. Inside the bedroom, Richard sat upright against a mountain of pillows, his face pale and slick with sweat, while oxygen equipment rested beside him. His eyes locked onto Eliza the moment she entered, searching her features with desperate intensity, as if comparing memory against reality. The room felt charged with unspoken accusations and unresolved history. He dismissed the guards, insisting he needed to question her privately, driven by a mixture of paranoia, guilt, and terrifying certainty. Eliza stood calmly near the foot of the bed, her posture professional and unreadable, while Richard struggled to control his ragged breathing. His voice cracked as he began asking questions about her family, her employment history, and whether she had ever lived near the estate years earlier. Each question carried hidden dread, as though he feared hearing the confirmation his conscience had whispered since investigators uncovered the remains. Eliza answered carefully, neither confirming nor denying the truth directly, allowing tension to stretch between them like a tightening wire ready to snap. Richard studied her face, while another brutal coughing fit seized his chest, forcing him to clutch the very pillows that continued delivering microscopic punishment with every desperate breath he inhaled. Because within moments, Richard would finally ask the one question that could expose everything she had hidden for 10 years, and Eliza would have to decide whether revealing her identity would complete her revenge or destroy it forever. Richard Beaumont stared at Eliza Carter as though he were looking at a ghost that had stepped out of his worst memory and into the suffocating present.
The storm outside pressed rain against the mansion windows, filling the room with the dull rhythm of water striking glass like a slow countdown toward inevitability. Richard's chest rose and fell unevenly as he forced himself to speak through pain that now felt permanently embedded in his lungs. His voice trembled, stripped of the authority that had once terrified everyone who worked under him. He asked her directly whether she had ever lost a sister who worked at the estate 10 years earlier, his words carrying a desperate mixture of fear and fragile hope that she might deny it. Eliza did not answer immediately. She walked closer to the bed with composed, deliberate steps while the silver thimble rested inside her closed palm. Her eyes held no anger, only a quiet exhaustion shaped by years of carrying grief without closure. She finally spoke with calm certainty, explaining that her sister had come to the estate as a temporary worker, chasing the same fragile dream that brought many young people into wealthy households. She described how her sister never returned home, how authorities dismissed the disappearance, and how power had erased accountability before anyone could demand justice. Richard's expression collapsed as recognition replaced denial, and his trembling hands clutched the bedding that had slowly been destroying him from the inside. He whispered a broken apology that sounded less like remorse and more like a man drowning in the realization that his past had returned with surgical precision. Eliza revealed that she had come back to the estate not for public justice or financial revenge, but for something far more personal. She explained that every stitch she placed into his bedding carried a memory he had tried to bury, and every breath he struggled to take mirrored the terror her sister experienced during her final moments inside the smokehouse. Richard stared at her with widening horror as the truth settled around him like invisible chains tightening with each labored inhale. Another violent coughing seizure overtook him, forcing his body to convulse as dark blood stained the silk pillowcase beneath his head. Eliza remained motionless, watching the final collapse of the man who had once controlled every corner of the estate. She neither touched him nor turned away, allowing the weight of consequence to unfold naturally without interference. The storm outside intensified, thunder echoing through the mansion halls, while investigators and servants remained unaware of the private reckoning unfolding inside the master bedroom. Minutes later, Richard's breathing slowed into shallow, fading gasps before finally dissolving into silence. The room felt heavier without the sound of his suffering, leaving only rain and distant thunder filling the space where his authority had once ruled without challenge. Eliza opened her hand and placed the silver thimble gently beside his lifeless hand, completing the promise she had carried for 10 years. She turned toward the window, watching emergency lights flicker across the rain-soaked estate as law enforcement prepared to expose the truth Richard had tried to erase forever. Some secrets rot beneath the surface until time forces them back into the light, and some justice arrives not through courts or confessions, but through consequences that cannot be escaped once they begin. If stories that uncover hidden darkness and long-buried truths keep you hooked, make sure to subscribe to Canon of Darkness for more chilling storytelling journeys. And remember, sometimes the dead do not return to haunt the living. They simply wait for the living to breathe in their unfinished story.